The family road trip just doesn't seem as popular as it once was. Families don't want to take the time anymore and more or less deal with the price of gas. But oldsters like me can certainly remember a time when the trip was as important as the destination. A cross-country family road trip was an entirely different prospect in 1908 than it would be in 2024 or even in 1974, before interstate highways, in many places before roads, before gas stations were common, when much of the middle United States was nothing much more than tumbleweeds. The idea of driving your family cross-country in an automobile was downright insane. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be done. On April 24th, 1908, the Murdock family left Los Angeles bound for New York in their Packard 30 automobile on what might be described as one of the most epic family road trips in history. In the first decade of the 20th century, Americans could cross the continent by rail, which was much faster than the routes that had to be taken by those making the journey during, for example, the California Gold Rush. But any other means, by horse or wagon or by the newest invention, the automobile was little easier than it had been in the days of the Oregon Trail. There was no national road network. The U.S. Department of Transportation writes that since the mid-19th century, roads have been universally recognized as a state and local responsibility, and if state and local officials let the roads deteriorate, so be it. That was their decision, and in an era when privately owned railroads dominated interstate travel and commerce, it was not a national concern. The first successful effort to cross the continental United States by automobile didn't occur until 1903. When a physician from Burlington, Vermont named H. Nelson Jackson, his chauffeur, Sewell Crocker, and a bull terrier pup named Bud traveled from San Francisco to New York in a two-cylinder, 20-horsepower Winton touring car. Jackson, who had made the trip on a dare, described the difficulty of the trip in an edition of the Buffalo New York News. "We have samples of mud from every state we crossed, plastered on that car." Later that year, drivers E.T. Tom Fetch and M.C. Crawrup made the trip from San Francisco to New York in a 4.5-horsepower Packard Model F. Fetch had been hired as a publicity stunt by a Packard investor to prove that American-made automobiles could negotiate the all-but-impassable mountain and desert roads and trails of the far west. Fetch and Crawrup made the trip in 61 days, beating Jackson and Corker's record by 2 days. In 1904, San Francisco and Lester Whitman and New Yorker C.S. Harris shattered that record, making the trip in just 33 days in a 10-horsepower Franklin runabout. The New York Times attributed their record-breaking speed to unusually favorable weather during almost the entire trip. 4 years later, that was still the record, and the United States was still a morass of mud and inconsistent roads, making cross-country trips by automobile more automobile company publicity stunt than leisure trip. But the cross-country family road trip's time had come. 45-year-old Joshua Murdock was a wealthy lumberman who had operated a company in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. However, he also owned a bungalow in Pasadena, California, where his family would spend their winters. In his 1908 book, A Family Tour from Ocean to Ocean, he explained, "Our many railway trips between our home in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and our bungalow in Pasadena, California, often suggested the same trip by automobile. During our last trip west, in March of this year, we discussed the possibility of returning overland in our Packard car, and the entire family was unanimous in believing that the hardships would be overbalanced by the pleasure." The family might not have fully appreciated those hardships. He noted our previous family touring had been over good roads. Investigating the possibility, he wrote, "I talked with ranchmen and mine owners who knew the western country. They discouraged me." Murdock sought out an expert. He was an acquaintance of the same Lester Whitman who had set the record in '04. Whitman advised him that it was possible to make the trip from coast to coast with his family in a big touring car, if you take time enough. Neither he nor I ever questioned each other or ourselves as to the exact meaning of time enough. Murdock also consulted with the Packard Company regarding his car. He wrote, "The prevailing opinion was that myself and the car were able to withstand the racket if my family was. My family was of the opinion that they could withstand the racket if the car could. Sporting blood won out." While the trip would not be the first cross-country trip by automobile, it would certainly be a first. Never before had the trip been made by a family in a touring car for pleasure. The car, baggage, and passengers, all told, would weigh approximately twice as much as any other that had ever made the trip. It was simply the first great family road trip across America by automobile. The Packard 30 had a 4-cylinder, vertical, water-cooled motor, which, as the name implies, was rated at 30 horsepower. Murdock's car had already been driven 5,400 miles. He described his preparations. The stock of small parts were stored under the rear seats with the side curtains. A small winch, with the possible use in the extreme emergency of getting out of bad holes, was strapped on the left running board. 2 hickory poles, 8 feet long, suitable as levers for the winch or pries for lifting the car out of deep mud or sand, were strapped to the right side of the car. Alongside those poles were strapped 2 shovels. They also carried ropes, blankets, tarps, a sledge, a poleaxe and a pickaxe, spare tires, a tire pump, a camp stove, 2 1-gallon and 4 2-gallon water canteens, and 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline. He explained that they did carry some protection. Our armament consists of a .30-30 Winchester for my son Milton to use in his unavailing warfare on coyotes. Milton was a good shot, but either the sights of the carbine were out of line or else the coyotes were good dodgers. He was understandably concerned about the availability of gasoline, and so rode ahead to ensure supply would be available. In a sign of how the postal system has changed, he was able to simply address letters to any automobile garage or gasoline dealer in towns along the way, and the letters got delivered. He received prompt assurances of there being ample gasoline supplies at the desired points. In the more remote locations, the gasoline could cost $2.50 for a 5-gallon can, but in other places it was as low as 18 cents a gallon. The car would carry 7 passengers: Murdock and his wife Annie, their daughters Lillian and Alice, his son J.M. Murdock Jr., whom they called Milton, a Packard mechanic named Philip DeMay, and for what they anticipated would be the most difficult part of the trip from Los Angeles to Ogden, they were joined by Lester Whitman. All told, car, passengers, and gear weighed, Murdock estimated, 5,500 pounds. I realized, he wrote, that we had a very heavy undertaking on our hands. They left Los Angeles at 8 in the morning on Friday, April 24th. It was a great and auspicious morning, he opined. The roads were good until they reached the mining town of Daggett, near Barstow. Daggett had boomed due to its connection to railroad routes and proximity to borax mines, but the borax works had closed in 1907, and by 1908 the town was in decline. The Murdocks were seeing a version of America that was already disappearing. Past Daggett was desert. Immediately upon leaving Daggett, Murdock wrote, the roads became very poor. In Daggett, they'd received directions from a liveryman to cross a dry lake called Coyote Lake, on the other side of which you will run into deep drift sand. Yes, it is pretty blamed bad. Most automobiles go that far and then turn back. The drift sand was quite an obstacle. The stuff is like quicksilver, he wrote. The more you shovel it, the deeper it gets. Anyone who has taken a road trip knows that it can get monotonous, and that was certainly the case in 1908. The coming night did not change the view much, he wrote, because there was nothing in the view to change. A vast lack of everything except sand. Crossing the Mojave Desert before roads was as difficult as you might imagine. Murdock described the land as a hot, dry, changeless waste of country, devoid of vegetation except an occasional boutonniere of mesquite bush. The road entirely disappeared in some places, and the only way to navigate was occasionally crossing the railroad routes. On one long stretch, the only people they saw were a burro train in charge of 2 men. Even where the roads were relatively good, they were often washed out in places. Bumping along the hard spots in the middle of the desert without a single sign of habitation or civilization, he wrote, it was easy to do a little incidental romancing, not to mention a little worrying should any serious accident occur in such a remote district. In places, they met people at ranches who were generally hospitable, and in larger places like Ely, Nevada, they found nice hotels, but they also faced unique obstacles. One night, sleeping in the desert, a coyote or some other alien of the night came through an open window and carried off Milton's trousers, Milton having carelessly taken them off before retiring. But while the coyotes couldn't be trusted, apparently the people could. Murdock wrote that the car was regularly garaged on the street. Practically all of our small articles and utensils were left in the car overnight, but never during the whole long trip were they disturbed. Water was difficult to find in Nevada. He wrote, even the lakes having quit business, with the only availability being at occasional wells. Usually there was a charge for water for teams of horses, but none for cars. It was a sign of change. The Westerner has a keen appreciation of progress, he wrote, and would like to see automobiles running thick and fast through this country. Whitman left them in Ogden, but they picked up other passengers. The proprietor of the Ogden garage agreed to accompany them to Evanston, Wyoming as a guide, where they met P.W. Spaulding, an attorney who was, coincidentally, planning to take the train to the Murdock's hometown of Johnstown. He decided to change his plans and accompany them instead. "It was one of the best deals in friendship I have ever made," Murdock wrote. "Spaulding was real, inside and out, and knew the Western country better than its mother." They continued to run into obstacles, bad and washed-out roads and mud. They found the town of Wamsutter, Wyoming, overrun with sheep-shearing gangs. Some of the herders started to shoot up the town about daybreak, but being sheepmen instead of the real article from cattle country, it was a comparatively mild and harmless celebration. In Omaha, they were surprised to find out that their trip had garnered interest. "We were soon surrounded by interrogative residents and reporters," the Omaha Evening World Herald wrote on May 14th. J.M. Murdock of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, with his wife, 2 daughters, and a son, arrived in Omaha Wednesday afternoon in an automobile from Los Angeles. The story describes some of the challenges that they had faced. In Wyoming, a blizzard was encountered, and the automobile barely missed the tornado in Nebraska on Tuesday. The blizzard, which he described as a genuine Western one, so full of snow that we couldn't see the fence alongside the road, occurred outside of Laramie, Wyoming. And as an alumnus of the University of Wyoming, I can say that running into a blizzard in Laramie in May is nothing surprising. You might think that the roads would be better as they went east, but in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, they ran into rains and mud. In Iowa, he wrote, "There were 2 kinds of mud, black in the bottomlands and yellow on the hillsides. We passed through a college town and noted that the colors were yellow and black." The University of Iowa website says that the colors black and gold were chosen by students at a mass meeting in 1897. The website doesn't mention mud being involved in the decision. By the time the Chicago Tribune reported their arrival in the city on May 18th, their trip was already making newspapers all over the country. The Tribune reported again on May 31st, noting that the group had finished the trip in 32 days, 2 hours, and 10 minutes, beating Whitman's 1904 record by half a day. Although the running time was actually only 25 and a half days, as the Murdocks, a religious family, took Sundays off. Murdock concluded by looking towards the future. "Now, when I look back at each of the thousands of hard-earned miles through which I clutched at the steering wheel from Los Angeles to New York, I wonder how long it will be before a real national pike extends from coast to coast and allows easy touring." Jacob Murdock published his book, A Family Tour from Ocean to Ocean, in cooperation with the Packard Motor Company. The book details miles of sand and dust, but also says, "Some of the scenes which we enjoyed were so beautiful that we thought them worth the trouble and hardship to which we had been subjected to in getting there over districts with no roads at all." The Murdock family road trip of 1908 deserves to be remembered for the adventure alone. It was the first time that women or children had gone on such a journey. They faced real hardships and real risks. They garnered the attention of the nation. They demonstrated what was possible in this age of the new automobile. They straddled the line between 19th and 20th century America, between the Wild West and the advent of civilization, between the antique and the modern. They witnessed places that would soon vanish, others that would soon rise. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.